The fantasy playoffs are in full swing, and just like we've come to expect from 2025, last week was full of shenanigans, underperforming studs, and ridiculous outcomes that shouldn't be happening, but are. But hopefully your team survived another week and you are one step closer to the ultimate goal of a fantasy championship. And if you're wondering what running backs that you should be starting this week, let's go ahead and dive into every single matchup, starting with Thursday Night Football, the Rams and Seahawks. The Seattle defense just got done shutting down Jonathan Taylor, and they have been super solid all season, allowing the 7th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. And we know right now that Kyren Williams and Blake Corum are in an even split, and both of them are producing fairly well. But they have to be fringe starts. Why? Because they're going to need touchdowns. Just like last week against Detroit, they played fairly well, but it was the touchdowns for both of them that made the entire fantasy day and made them both fantasy viable. If we're looking at just yards alone, we're going to have trouble finding a space for either of these guys in our fantasy lineups. But if they can each get into the end zone, they both would be fantasy worthy, even as a flex. For Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet, I think this point of the season, we should probably just go ahead and be done with them. The Rams matchup on Thursday night is extremely tough. They're allowing the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game, and they just shut down Jahmyr Gibbs. Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet should be firmly on our bench this week. We have 2 Saturday games here in Week 16. Philadelphia and Washington will be the first one, starting at 5 p.m. on Saturday, and Saquon Barkley has looked much better over the last couple of weeks than he has all season long. And for those of you that were able to get into the fantasy playoffs, even with your first round pick being a disaster this season, Saquon Barkley is heating up at the perfect time, and now he's got a Washington matchup allowing the 6th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs and just allowed 2 touchdowns to Tyrone Tracy. After Chris Rodriguez ended up being out last week, Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt had his first fantasy viable day in what seems like forever, running for 96 yards and a touchdown. But this Philly defense is going to be a whole lot different than the Giants defense that he faced last week, and it's going to end up being much tougher. But what if Chris Rodriguez does end up playing this week? Then we're going to see an even split, or Chris Rodriguez may come back and take that job. I think right now, at the beginning of the week against a Philadelphia defense, knowing that Jaden Daniels is done for the year and there's going to be no possibility of him playing, I would skip on anybody in this backfield. The second Saturday game, Green Bay at Chicago, is going to have huge playoff implications. If Green Bay wins this game against Chicago, it's really going to come down to Week 18. If the Lions can win out the next couple of weeks, then Detroit will be at Chicago in Week 18 for a trip to the playoffs. But after a loss last week, Green Bay needs to win this game to get back into the conversation to win the division this year. Josh Jacobs looked great last week in a really tough matchup, scored on the ground, and had one of the more impressive receiving touchdowns that you will see from a running back. And this week, going up against Chicago, he's going to be in a solid matchup once again. And just a couple of weeks ago against Chicago, wondering if Josh Jacobs was going to be able to play, he ran for 86 yards and a touchdown, finished as a top 12 running back. Josh Jacobs, once again, is going to have touchdown potential and is a very solid play. I don't know if we should feel nearly as comfortable about the Chicago running backs, however, especially Kyle Monangai. Just a few weeks ago, he was a touchdown machine. It felt like we could use him as a flex option every single week because he was getting decent volume and he was being utilized in enough situations to score a touchdown. But now he's gone back-to-back weeks without a TD. And if he's not scoring, he's not worth a start. And in this matchup against the Packers, who are allowing the 8th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, considering the fact that DeAndre Swift is still getting a majority of the touches, Kyle Monangai is going to be a sit for me this week because if he doesn't score, he's not getting enough carries to be worthy of a fantasy start. DeAndre Swift was not great against Green Bay a couple of weeks ago, but with no Micah Parsons moving forward, you gotta wonder exactly what this defense will look like and if it will be as daunting on the ground as it has been so far this season. I know when you think of Parsons, you think of a pass pass rusher, but when you lose a player of his caliber, it changes a lot of what you do within your defense. So DeAndre Swift, who has actually been very efficient over the last few weeks, volume-wise, should still end up being there. And if he can be just as efficient, I think he's going to be a guy that's going to be kind of on that top 24 outside area, looking into the top 15. The first game on the Sunday slate we're going to talk about is Buffalo at Cleveland, and this is going to be my underdog must-watch matchup of the week at the running back position. James Cook, Quinshon Judkins. We've got some great opportunity here for a couple of different reasons. And if you're over on Underdog right now, that is awesome. But if you're not, playing along with us over on Underdog is a great way to finish out the 2025 season. Maybe you've had a ton of success in fantasy football this year and you want to keep riding that high and keep dominating. Well, you can do that over on Underdog. Or maybe your fantasy season just didn't go the way that you would like and you need a little bit of redemption. Yep, you can do that over on Underdog as well. And we've been super active over on Underdog this year with pick'ems, with any type of best ball draft. It doesn't matter. All of their fantasy games over there give you an opportunity to get back into the game every single week. Your season doesn't have to be over yet. And we're going to have tons of content for the playoffs as well. So make sure you follow along right here and get signed up over on Underdog. If you use code Headliners, you're going to get a super special pick'em that is almost guaranteed to hit. And you can pair that along with all of the other pick'ems that we talk about throughout the week, whether here on the channel or over on Discord. But not only that, you're also going to get up to $75 in bonus games when you play your first $5 game. Make a deposit of at least $10, play your first $5 game, heck, even use that super special pick'em that we just talked about, and you're going to get an opportunity to also keep playing throughout the rest of the postseason with us as well. Buffalo at Cleveland, and Cleveland's defense was once one of the more daunting defenses to run against in the entire NFL. But here as of recent, they have had a ton of trouble stopping the run game. We were just talking about the Bears. DeAndre Swift ran for almost 100 yards and 2 touchdowns against this Cleveland defense, and they have given up big games to other running backs as well. And James Cook, well, he cooked, pun intended, one of the better run defenses in all of football last week, the New England Patriots. And now James Cook has been a top 10 running back in 4 of his last 5 games. I'm not worried about Cook this week against Cleveland. This might be Quinshon Judkins' last opportunity. Going up against the Buffalo Bills, who are currently allowing the 5th most fantasy points per game and got absolutely destroyed on a couple of huge runs by TreVeyon Henderson last week. If Quinshon Judkins cannot come through this week, then there's definitely no reason to try and play him in week 17, or if for some reason your season goes that far, all the way out to week 18. Quinshon Judkins has had some really good opportunities, and he's had better quarterback play as of late, except for last week, and he still isn't doing anything. And I'm not exactly sure why he's lost so much efficiency and why he's been so bad in the back half of the season, because he's had a good schedule, he's had better quarterback play, but unfortunately he's just not getting the job done. And a matchup like this against Buffalo, who can't stop the run game to save their lives right now, we have to start Quinshon Judkins. You really don't have a decision to make here unless you have 3 running backs that all have top 12 upside. For the Chargers and the Cowboys, Omarion Hampton is going to be a fringe start for me. And the Dallas Cowboys are still allowing the 7th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. But at one point this season, they were allowing the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing running backs. That run defense has gotten way better over the last few weeks. And even though against the Detroit Lions, they did get shredded pretty hard, they've been solid stopping the run outside of that game. Omarion Hampton is the number 1 running back right now, but Kimani Vidal is still seeing a solid amount of touches. Vidal last week had 12 carries, and yeah, Omarion Hampton had 15, and he had more yards per carry. It really doesn't matter because this is a tougher matchup than what Dallas has been at one point in time. Kimani Vidal getting double-digit targets hurts Omarion Hampton's floor, and if he doesn't really have that high of a ceiling, unfortunately he has to be looked at as more of an RB3 to low-end RB2 this week. I would say top 24, top 20 is probably his ceiling. You could see him going anywhere into the top 30 at this point, meaning he's more of a flex than anything. For Javonte Williams, we're going to have to keep an eye on his health for the rest of the week. It is likely that he's going to be questionable running into this matchup. And this Chargers defense is playing very well right now. And if it wasn't for a fake tush-push toss that went to Saquon Barkley for a huge run a couple of weeks ago against the Eagles, they would be playing much better against running backs right now than what the numbers currently show. So for Javonte Williams, is he going to be a start for me this week? If he plays, yes, he will still be a start. His upside will probably be limited. I don't think he'll pass 100 yards, and I think we're really banking on a touchdown at that point, but we have to keep an update on his health, because if he's limited, then maybe that changes some of the things that we have to think about with our lineup. For Kansas City and Tennessee, things are going to look wildly different for the Kansas City Chiefs this week with no Patrick Mahomes, and I would be willing to bet they're probably going to run the ball quite a bit with Isaiah Pacheco and Kareem Hunt. I'm going to put them both as fringe starts because I think both of these guys are probably flex options this week. Pacheco led the way last week. He had 11 carries. Kareem Hunt only had 6. I think both of these guys have some touchdown potential. I think Isaiah Pacheco probably gets the majority of the volume once again, but going up against Tennessee, they both have an opportunity to put up some fantasy numbers. If you want to only pick one based on what we saw last week, I would go with Isaiah Pacheco over Kareem Hunt. But both of these guys could end up getting double-digit touches this week. Tony Pollard has been absolutely miserable for 90% of the season, and then all of a sudden, after fantasy owners have tossed him to the side, sent him to the waivers, and definitely decided that we're not playing him, he has a couple of big fantasy performances in back-to-back weeks. But here's the thing, for a majority of the year, Tony Pollard has been terrible, and it's not completely his fault. A lot of it has to do with the offense, the growth of Cam Ward, and I don't think it's shocking that Cam Ward has played better the last couple of weeks when Tony Pollard has also played a whole lot better. Those things probably correlate to each other. But this is a matchup going up against the Chiefs, who are allowing the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. And if for whatever reason you decide to start Tony Pollard this week and he doesn't do anything, you are going to be kicking yourself in the butt for looking at the last couple of weeks and saying to yourself, why did I let that blind me to the fact that he didn't do anything all season long? For me this week and the rest of the playoffs, Tony Pollard would remain on my bench even if you've picked him up. The only way I'm playing him is if for some reason you're dealing with a ton of injuries or you just barely made it into the playoffs and you're surviving by a hope right now. Cincinnati at Miami, and the Bengals got blown out last week, which is crazy because if you look at the box score, they didn't just lead in time possession, they dominated in time of possession, which is crazy to see for a team that couldn't even kick a field goal last week. Chase Brown was not good on the ground, but he added 7 receptions, which helped his fantasy day and put him back inside the top 24 once again. If there's no T. Higgins this week, which as of this recording, he is still in the concussion protocol, then Chase Brown will probably see some decent targets once again. You might be looking at Samaje Perine, but really last week in his performance was based on score more than anything. The Cincinnati Bengals are still allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, and Devon Achane has been one of the best, maybe the most consistent running back in all of football this season. And there were a couple of trolls in the comments last week getting really upset because I made a comment about how Devon Achane is an RB2. Let me go ahead and say it once again for those of you that aren't listening. Devon Achane has been an RB2 every single game this season. He is the only running back in fantasy football to do that. So when you play Devon Achane, you're playing a guy that is an RB2 floor, but also has tons of RB1 upside every single week. I hope that was easy enough to understand for some of you. Breece Hall, at the very best, is a fringe start flex option this week. But going up against New Orleans, to me, he feels way more of just a sit if you have enough options. Isaiah Davis had a solid week last week. And when you take a look at what Isaiah Davis did, it probably was due to game score more than anything, But maybe the Jets at this point are like, hey, let's find out what we have with Davis since Breece Hall is likely going to be gone anyway at this point. Hall has very limited upside, but even before Davis really took over at the end of the game, Hall was terrible even before that. So right now, if I had to make a decision, if I had 3 running backs inside the top 24, I would probably pick every single one of them over Breece Hall. The Jets are allowing the 3rd most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, but we don't even know who the running back for New Orleans may be this coming week. Alvin Kamara is still going to be questionable. Devin Neal is going to be questionable. He ended up having to leave after scoring last week. And if Devin Neal is healthy this week and Kamara can't play again, Neal is going to be a start. If for some reason Kamara ends up returning and Neal doesn't play, then Kamara will be a start. This is way too good of a matchup, but we'll have to keep an eye on this situation throughout the entirety of the week. We'll update you either in the rankings or the live shows on Friday. Minnesota at the New York Giants, who are currently allowing the 2nd most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. And even Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt found success last week, so I would be willing to bet that Aaron Jones and Jordan Mason will find success this week as well, especially considering the fact that J.J. McCarthy has been playing great football over the last couple of weeks, which is going to help the run game out. I think Aaron Jones is way safer with way more upside, but Jordan Mason should still have a decent enough floor with touchdown potential. Last week, Tyrone Tracy had 70 yards on the ground, and he added a couple of touchdowns as well, 1 rushing and 1 passing. But his matchup last week against Washington is way different than his matchup this week against Minnesota. Really, we're hoping for some help in the passing game again this week. If he can do that, he could end up being a fringe flex start for us. But I don't know if he scores a touchdown, and I don't know if he's successful enough on the ground to warrant actually trying to play him this week either. If you have Bucky Irving on your fantasy team, then either A, you have some PTSD from last week and you're not feeling great about having to play him this week, or B, you're no longer in the fantasy playoffs because he didn't perform well last week. But here's the thing, when he came back from his injury, he had back-to-back games with more than 15 fantasy points. Everybody was starting Bucky Irving last week. Nobody was benching him. You could have had 4 running backs on your team with top 24 potential. You would have been playing Bucky Irving. I highly doubt anybody out there actually set him. Unfortunately, that's just the way it goes sometimes in fantasy football, especially here in 2025. But the good news is, going up against Carolina, who allow the 9th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, Bucky Irving will be a solid play once again. Rachaad White and Sean Tucker didn't get nearly enough volume last week to worry me about Bucky Irving. Tucker scored a touchdown, which you don't love to see, but I think Bucky Irving will end up being just fine this week. And Tampa Bay is literally right behind Carolina. They're allowing the 10th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Rico Dowdle was substantially better than Chuba Hubbard last week, and after we started to see a little bit of an uptick in Chuba Hubbard usage, it disappeared. Right now, the safest bet on this team is going to be Rico Dowdle. Maybe Chuba Hubbard could be a flex option if you need an emergency play, but if I had to go with anybody, it will be Rico, and I'll list him as a start because it's a good matchup. 3 receptions, 3 touchdowns for Travis Etienne Jr. last week. Hopefully, you were playing him and not playing against him. For Travis Etienne this week, it is a tough matchup. It is not one that I feel great about. Denver's allowing the fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, and that's even after giving up a receiving and a rushing touchdown to Josh Jacobs last week. But a couple of different factors here. Number one, Baichel Tutin will not be available this week, and at least for the next couple of weeks because of surgery on his finger. So Travis Etienne will be the guy. He is going to see a ton of work this week and probably could be right around 20 touches. And number two, Trevor Lawrence is playing great the last 3 weeks. And because of that, Travis Etienne could find a little bit more success because they will be worried about the passing game as well. Whereas earlier in the season when Trevor Lawrence wasn't playing nearly as good, they may have been able to crash on Travis Etienne and would have really limited his upside. I think his upside is limited anyway, but I do think his floor is a lot better in this matchup than what we've seen for a lot of other running backs this season. RJ Harvey, unfortunately, is dealing with a rib injury right now, and because of that, he is probably going to be questionable this week, and we really are going to have to keep an eye out on his status throughout practice, the rest of the week, and of course into our rankings and live shows to give you more updates on RJ Harvey. If he ends up playing this week, we have to know exactly how limited he may be. It is a tougher matchup, but if he plays this week, he's got touchdown potential. He has 10 total touchdowns on the season now, and a touchdown in each of the last 3 games. So even if he's a little bit banged up, and even if it's a tougher matchup, you would have to list RJ Harvey as a fringe start because he has touchdown potential. Atlanta at Arizona, who's currently allowing the 4th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. This is the type of matchup where Bijan Robinson could absolutely go off, but it's also the type of matchup that Tyler Algier could end up finding the end zone as well. The hope is that Tyler Algier, if you're trying to flex him this week, gets 10 total touches on the ground, is highly efficient, giving you about 40 yards or so, and can end up scoring a touchdown. Bijan Robinson, between his work on the ground and in the passing game, could be a top 5 running back. I'll go ahead and list Michael Carter as a fringe start. He was the lead back last week after Bam Knight went down with an injury. And Emari Demercado, who is questionable throughout the week, ended up playing. So for Bam Knight, will he be able to go this coming Sunday? If he doesn't, Michael Carter is going to be a fringe start based on the potential volume alone. Last week, he had 14 carries and added 4 targets as well. With no Bam Knight, he is likely going to be the RB1 once again. Pittsburgh at Detroit, and Jaylen Warren and Kenneth Gainwell are nothing more than flex options for me this week against the Detroit defense that has been very good, slowing down the run game this season. Right now, even after allowing 3 touchdowns to Corum and Williams last week, they're still allowing the 2nd fewest fantasy points per game on the season to running backs. Jaylen Warren hasn't been nearly as good this late part of the season as he was in the earlier portion of the season, and Kenneth Gainwell continues to get a ton of looks. If I had to play one of these guys for safety this week, it would be Kenneth Gainwell because of his potential work in the passing game. Jahmyr Gibbs has been very good this season. He's also been very inconsistent. Right now, over the back half of the season, in terms of touchdowns, he has seen 0, 3, 0, 3, 0, 3, and 0 touchdowns per game. So the dude is either blowing up and is the top 2 running back, or he's not doing anything and he's killing your fantasy team. Hopefully, this week going up against the Pittsburgh Steelers, who are allowing the 10th fewest fantasy points per game, Jahmyr Gibbs can get back on track. And the good news is that's at home. Also for David Montgomery, he has a touchdown in 3 straight games, so he could end up seeing his 4th straight touchdown this week. Las Vegas at Houston, and trust me when I say I don't want to play Ashton Jeanty this week. The only reason I'm considering him as a fringe option is because the potential work in the passing game. If you take his work on the ground alone, he's not going to give you very many fantasy points. The dude could get 14 carries and probably give you 30 yards. It's going to be terrible. But if he could get 5, 6, 7 targets in the passing game, if he could catch 5, 6, 7 of those passes, he could end up actually putting in just enough work to get into the top 24 running backs. It's just, do you believe he's going to get that work, or will he get left out in the snow? Las Vegas is allowing the 8th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. So the hope is that Woody Marks will be healthy this week. But we also don't know if Nick Chubb could be back this week. Woody Marks has left each of the last 13 games early for the Houston Texans with an injury. And yet he always seems like he's ready to go the next week. One day it seems like his season's completely done, and the next day he's out there as a top 24 option. Jawar Jordan, he ended up having a solid day last week. He ran for 101 yards on 15 carries. Now, 50 of those yards came on one play, so majority of the day wasn't all that great, but he did have one really big run. We have to hope that Woody Marks is available this week, and we'll keep an eye on that throughout the week. If Woody Marks can't play, but maybe Nick Chubb plays, then Nick Chubb could end up being a fringe option. New England at Baltimore on Sunday Night Football, and New England blew a huge lead against the Buffalo Bills last week, and I know that one does not feel great, but they could get back on track against Baltimore this week. And TreVeyon Henderson going up against Baltimore is going to be a start for me, and I'm going to stay away from Ramondre Stevenson. Stevenson. If it was a really good matchup, then maybe you could talk about Rhamondre Stevenson as a flex, but after some more explosive plays last week, I don't see how TreVeyon Henderson doesn't lead this backfield in touches once again. He's definitely going to get more carries on the ground than Rhamondre Stevenson, but Stevenson still continues to work into the passing game a little bit. Both of them had 3 targets. Henderson had 14 attempts, Stevenson only had 6. Really, at this point, you still worry about TreVeyon Henderson just because Rhamondre Stevenson is lurking, but his upside is so big with that big playability. Derrick Henry feels a little risky this week. Right now, New England is allowing the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Now, they got slaughtered by James Cook last week, and because of that, maybe this defense, maybe there's some holes, maybe there's a couple of gaps that Derrick Henry can find for some bigger plays. Maybe he can find the end zone this week, but he has back-to-back games with 90 or more yards right now. Derrick Henry doesn't feel great, but he definitely feels like a start still. San Francisco at Indianapolis on Monday Night Football, and Christian McCaffrey versus Jonathan Taylor is going to be great to watch. We know what Christian McCaffrey is going to do. We know he's going to give you a ton of volume on the ground, through the air, and we know he's going to be one of the better fantasy viable running backs in all of football. Jonathan Taylor has been struggling as of recent, and hopefully against San Francisco, he can get back on track. Jonathan Taylor was probably the fantasy MVP for a majority of the season, and then in week 9 against Pittsburgh, a matchup that he should have played a lot better in, he finished as the RB30, and it was the worst performance he's had all year. Now, he did bounce back the week after against Atlanta in an international game and was the RB1 and had more fantasy points than anybody else this season. We felt good about Jonathan Taylor heading into the bye week, and then it has been all downhill since then. Since the bye week, Jonathan Taylor has been the RB26, RB19, RB20, and RB21. He's averaged under 4 yards a carry in all but one of those games, in which he averaged exactly 4 yards per carry. He hasn't run for 100 yards in a game since before the bye week. He's had 87, 74, 85, and 58 on the ground, but he's only scored 1 touchdown over the last 4 games. And that's why he's had such a huge fall and why his fantasy upside has not been there for you the last few weeks. In this matchup going up against San Francisco, the hope is that he gets back on track. But with Phillip Rivers starting again, you got to wonder if San Francisco is going to game plan to take Jonathan Taylor out of the game. Headliner Nation, there's my breakdown on every single matchup here in Week 16 at the running back position, and hopefully it gave you enough information to start thinking about what you want to do with your fantasy lineups. But we have a few guys that are injured this week, and we're not going to know a whole lot more about them until later in the week. So stay tuned to the ranking show, stay tuned to the live show, get updates as the week goes on what we think will happen with some of these running backs who are banged up right now. But before you get out of here, do me a favor, interact with the video, whether it's just hitting the like button, subscribing if you're new, turning on bell notifications, leaving a comment, hyping the video, whatever it may be. If you could take a minute to interact with the video, we would greatly appreciate it. But Headliner Nation, stay safe and healthy, and I'll catch you on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.